Hello and welcome to the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. In this second season of the show, host Jorden Guth is joined by a new guest each episode who knows something about hi-fi that Jorden doesn't. And who knows, while he's learning about all of this, you might learn something too. So with no further ado, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. Today, we are joined with Doug Schneider, the founder of SoundStage Network, as well as Dennis Berger. Dennis is, of course, the producer for this podcast, as well as the editor for SoundStage Access. So it's been 6 months since we started the Audiophile Podcast with me as the host. And I wanted to get Doug and Dennis to come back on, kind of review where we've gone so far, the people that we've talked to, and the topics, and see kind of what their feedback is, and if there's anything else that we should think about exploring for the next 6 months. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Jorden.
Hey, Jorden. Thanks for having me on, man.
Thanks for coming back on and not just being behind the scenes. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm out of my comfort zone here.
So I guess to start, it's been 6 months. It's been quite some time. And I have had the pleasure and experience that not a lot of people in the hi-fi world have had of being able to really dive into the brains of some of the kind of leading people in the industry. I really wanted to kind of get back together with you two and see what your thoughts are on how it's going so far, topics that you thought were interesting or didn't expect to happen, and kind of get some feedback and see kind of where we can go from here.
Yeah, and I think also I would like to hear from you about what stands out and what you've learned in the 6 months that you've been talking to these experts. Like, what stands out in terms of what has resonated most for you? What has changed the way you think about hi-fi the most, or has it? And I guess the first question I had for you was, we had 2 back-to-back episodes a while back. So we had Bernie Grunman on, and we followed that up with Mark Waldrop.
Yeah.
2 brilliant mastering engineers with very, very different perspectives on audio. Bernie has a very, very analog driven focus and had some, I would say, unkind things to say about digital from his perspective, and he explained them very well. And then Mark came on immediately after and had some not nice things to say about analog and explained why he worked entirely in the digital domain. In a sense, that seems like a contradiction, and you were presented with those back to back. How did you feel when you were sort of met with 2 engaging, informative people, experts in their field who had such diametrically opposed opinions? Did you take one side or the other? Did you just let both of them simmer? Like, how did that work on your brain, man?
So it's interesting because I actually think back to both of those quite often. I would say, me personally, I fall more on the digital side, simply because of the ease of digital. But that being said, I now listen to records with a totally different mindset. Like when I hear a vinyl go down, and kind of the I forget the exact phrase that was used, but it's like music is vibration, and analog is the best way to kind of experience that, because it's this like actual mechanical vibration that is making that sound. And that kind of resonates with me a lot more than it did previously, where I just thought the vinyl craze was more of like not a status symbol, but almost like I don't know, an uppity way of doing things.
Or a fad, maybe.
I didn't want to say fad.
It would be hard to call a 100-year-old format a fad, but you know.
Well, that's it. It's like the resurgence of it may be a fad, but.
Well, yeah. I think you could you compare it to your experience with video? Because you get film, you get the same thing happening on the video side. Well, not on the video side, but like the filmmaker side of film versus digital. It's similar, right?
It is very similar. And I think when it comes to video, and maybe it's just because my ears are less tuned than my eyes in that sense. And that just might be because I've been into video for so much longer and all that. I could very easily see the differences between like a film and a digital reproduction of image. You're looking at grain, you're looking at noise, you're looking at like the highlight fall off and how things kind of expose the image.
Halation.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I have the tuned ears to notice that difference as much with music. Obviously, vinyl has like a very almost distinct sound to it, just that crackling, that kind of organic.
Literally crackling, ticks, pops, surface noise, everything.
Exactly. Now, in terms of video, I also do see that film a lot of the time is actually used as kind of like a gimmick nowadays. There's some legitimate reasons why people shoot on film versus shooting digitally, but a lot of people might just shoot on film because it's kind of like this gimmicky thing. They get to say that they shot on film, and maybe that's the same in the audiophile world. Maybe that's part of it as well. But it was kind of an interesting take of the benefits of analog vinyl recordings. Even the process of like lacquer recordings and all of that, I think that really opened up my my mind to why that format is still around and still used today.
You've also had an opportunity to talk to a lot of different, not necessarily speaker manufacturers, but representatives from speaker manufacturers, speaker companies. Are there any of those that particularly stand out to you that have changed the way you think about speakers, speaker design, speaker purchasing, speaker auditioning, whatever?
And let me interject something here because I've been saying this to Jorden. He's really getting a PhD level course in speakers. Many reviewers don't know jack shit about speakers. They don't even talk to anybody. They go on their own ideas, yet he's been able to talk to some of the best in the business. I mean, he's talked to Jack Oakley Brown at KEF, Michael Hedges at Monitor Audio. You're going to be talking to Lawrence Dickey from Bowers & Wilkins, formerly, then Vivid Audio now, next week. But you hung out with them when we were in England earlier this year and on and on. So you're getting a PhD level course kind of on loudspeakers. You probably know more than most reviewers do right now.
Yeah, I have to take a step back and realize how fortunate I am to be able to interact with a lot of these people. Dennis, to answer the question, I am very much still a KEF fanboy, so I really enjoyed talking to Dr. Jack Oakley Brown. That was really fascinating and really kind of cool. There's also this thing when we were talking to the two Michaels from Monitor Audio last week, or the week before. The fact that they approached the M array of the hyphen speaker, the similarities between that design and the KEF UniQ, basically having the mid-range and then in the center of the mid-range having the tweeter and kind of the benefits of that design, they approached it very differently, but essentially they're working at the same problem and have somewhat of the same solution, but realized very differently. So I think that was really, really cool. I'm going to say the top one, though, the absolute top one for me was actually Anthony Grimani when it comes to the room acoustics and how that impacts the overall sound of stuff. And I think that was the biggest one for me because it's one that is often overlooked when people are talking about hi-fi and loudspeakers and all this stuff. And even in my day-to-day life, like I was at my kids' like parent-teacher interview last night, and I'm looking around the gymnasium and they have sound isolation panels, and I'm like, I wonder if this is covering more than 10% of the space, or if they care for that stuff. All of these things now kind of enter my brain when I walk into a space. So yeah. I think that was the one that really I would say gave me the biggest leaps and bounds in terms of my appreciation for the art of hi-fi and music reproduction.
Cool.
So let me ask you now about measurements. This is always a contentious issue in audio, and you kind of really came from the outsider looking in point of view.
Yep.
What have you found out about measurements? What did you think about all the discussions we've had about measurements?
So, and I guess this is also one of the areas that I was blissfully ignorant in, which is this idea that, like, of course you would measure things. Like, why wouldn't you measure things? Why wouldn't you look at this stuff? Also coming from the film side of things, or the video side of things, there's an element of specs don't matter. They matter in some degree to like achieve a baseline and to show a level of quality. But after that, they really don't matter. If you're comparing like a I don't know, a Sony camera to a Canon camera to a whatever, generally speaking, they're all going to produce really good images. And that was kind of my understanding with like high-end speakers as well.
And that's a good net, because they'll all produce really good images, and you have to look at them.
Yeah.
To see which one you like. Like the specs won't tell you. The specs won't tell you. So there's certain measurements there that are very important, but in the end, you got to look at the thing just like you got to listen to the thing.
Exactly. And I think that's a major thing for me, because even when it comes to cameras, me personally, I don't like shooting on Sony as much. I find the colors are not quite the way that I would like them to be right out of the camera. I like shooting on Canon. Now, taking that into the speaker side of things, I understand the huge benefits. Like the Hyphen to me sounded amazing. Like that speaker was absolutely incredible. I listened to, I think it was the Wilson speakers at Sim Audio as well a while back. Those sounded really good to me. I listened to a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm just a Kef fanboy. So like, I just like the sound of those blades for some reason. Like it just really resonated with me, or it gave me that emotional connection. When it comes to measurements, what I didn't really expect is that some people would go to the farthest end and be like, no specs matter. I would definitely say that you need to look at measurements in order to get a baseline, and then go from that baseline and say, well, what suits my specific style, purpose, all of those other things.
And that's a good place to be at, because that's exactly it. You got to look at the measurements, and you got to use the product and listen to it.
Well, we used to have a troll on the on Doug's Facebook page, Ernie Fisher, who would lambaste us for doing measurements on SoundStage. And he's not the only one. There are a lot of people with that attitude, and he called it a crutch. He was like, I don't need measurements. I have my ear. I know what sounds good and I know what sounds bad. You guys don't, so you have to measure. And it's like, well, no, you're either misrepresenting or misunderstanding what we do here. But I've been thinking about that a lot. I've been thinking about that attitude, and I think it boils down to this. I think there are two types of people who express their voice in the domain of hi-fi and audiophilia. I think there are a type of people who want to be seen as gurus and who want you to come back to them time and time again. Like, I am here to give you the truth. The truth is received from me. I will tell you what's good. I will tell you what works best together. I will tell you what to purchase every time you're going to make a purchase. There are other people whom I respect more, who I think take the attitude of, I would like to teach you how this stuff works. I would like to teach you the correlation between measurements and performance, just to explain to you what this stuff means so you can figure it out for yourself. So you can go and look at a frequency response graph, or, phase and impedance, and understand what that means. And it seems to me that the people who don't want you to be able to make those decisions for yourself are very anti-measurement. Doug, does that ring true for you?
Yeah, and the guru thing is, if you want somebody to just come on and bullshit and be the guru and tell people, I know what sounds great, you'll gain a lot of readers, because if they can get them to buy into the guru thing, you kind of have something there. But at the same time, they're full of shit, because you got to put your money where your mouth is. And I think I brought this up in a podcast a long time ago at NRC. They would do this thing, and I did it, where you would listen and draw the frequency response of what you were listening to. In-room frequency response. In other words, can you tell what you're actually hearing? So back to the guru thing, and you find this in all things. Pretentious people go to Status and Culture, right? The book, Dennis. Mm-hmm. Get these people who want high status by proclaiming that they are some guru in something, and they have these followers, but when it comes to push comes to shove, they can't back it up. right? And so I've always wrestled with that, because if you want to be entertaining, you get a guru and let him pontificate, or her, about what they think. But the truth is, you're spouting BS in most cases. And there's a balance again in the middle. Do you agree, Dennis?
Yeah, there was a video a while back where somebody, I can't remember who it was, and I wish I could, but there was some audio guru talking about what it means when we say a resolving speaker. And he gave some examples, but he would never give an actual description so that anyone else could take his metrics and apply them. And he ended by saying, if you want to know what is a good resolving speaker, call up our customer service. They'll talk to you, and it's just like, no, man, no, I see what you're doing. You're just trying to keep people on the hook. You want people calling your company and coming to them for advice, even though, it's frustrating to me. So yeah,
that just brings up a thought. I still to this day, like, people will say, oh, this speaker, like, I understand when it sounds warm and understand like the basics, but I need like a lexicon of like audiophile terms that is like, when they say this, you're looking at these and this and this and that, and kind of just have like a baseline. Because the other thing is, when it comes to words and our interpretations of words, what might be considered warm or bright to me might be not that to Doug, or not that to you, Dennis. So
No, I mean, unless there's just something wrong with your hearing, which, as Doug and I continue to age, is entirely possible. Yeah.
For some of the terms, it's pretty, like, I would say a bright speaker or bright headphones, like that would be pretty even.
Right.
But when it comes to some of these other terms, like,
every time I edit a review, and some writer writes something about inner detail, I write, but what does this mean? What can you point to something and say, this is what I mean by inner detail? I can describe inner detail in such a way that you can go and hear whether something has good inner detail or not. Explain that, or cut the freaking term, because it's just this gobble language that is entered into the common vernacular of audiophilia, but it doesn't really mean anything, and you'll find that there's a lot of that. And I think here's one of the coolest things about this podcast for me, you taking over and going on this adventure that we get to witness in real time. So many times, people who are taking new interest in the hobby come in and they hear, oh, well, all of these people are talking about inner detail. I don't really know what that means, but I better act like I know what that means, or people aren't going to take me seriously. So then they'll go and do their first review and they're like, oh, this product has great inner detail. And they don't know what it means, because it doesn't mean anything. But you are getting to talk to some of the best experts in the field. And as you go on your journey, you're not going to fall into those same traps, right? And I think also you have a quizzical mind. So instead of going, well, I better act like I know what this means, you're like, hey, what does that mean? Right? So I think that's a really good thing.
Hey, Dennis. Sorry, Jordan.
Go for it.
Dennis, write that down as a editorial topic. What the F is inner detail? Serious?
Yes. Okay, cool. I'm on it. Always loving getting ideas, man.
You just kind of hit something in my brain here. Out of all the people we talk to, terms like inner detail and these kind of fluffy terms have not come up.
Yeah.
And
because these people know what the heck they're talking about.
Exactly. It's really interesting when the way that you just kind of phrase that, because it's like, I'm trying to remember the exact quote or whatever it is, but it's like, you don't know something unless you can explain that something to a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah.
If you truly know something, then you can simplify it and kind of dumb it down for other people, like make it relatable, and kind of teach at least the fundamentals, at least the basics.
One of my favorite physics books is called How to Explain Quantum Physics to Your Dog.
Yeah.
And it is that premise. Like, if you can't break these concepts down into such simple terms that literally anybody can understand them, then you don't really understand them. So
exactly. And I think that's an interesting bit, because out of everyone that we've talked to, I don't think anyone's been like pretentious about it or been like.
And, one of your favorite guys in audio, and I've always really liked talking to him, is Jack Oakley Brown. I always said that this guy would be like a great professor, because when I'm at CAF, and I've been there a few times, him and I will get into really detailed conversations that are way over my head. And he will say, okay, let's go to the whiteboard. And he will have me draw things on the whiteboard. Okay, what do you think this means? He'll say, no, that's not right. Draw this, draw that. And he will dumb it down to where I'm at, right? It's the most complex things and explain them perfectly. And I come out with, oh, that's a clear understanding of that. The guy knows his stuff when he can do that.
Hey, Jorden.
Yeah.
Something Doug just said that I want you to hone in on and remember and listen to. Okay. There's not a lot of publishers in this field who would say, hey, there's a topic that I don't fully 100% understand, right? and Doug just said, hey, there's this thing. I'm not an expert on it. Can you explain it to me? There's this wonderful new video on the SoundStage YouTube channel that's basically just explaining the relationship between, it's explaining Ohm's law and how that relates to the performance of amplifiers. And it's wonderful. And I'm loving to see that video take off. But the whole premise of that video was Doug saying, hey, I mentioned this thing, but I don't really fully understand it 100%. So I'm going to go to somebody who does. That video is amazing. And you will understand more about amplifiers than most people will ever understand if you, A, watch that video, but B, take that approach when you're talking to people who know more than you do.
And you know what, too? And I'm happy because I was a computer guy. And in the computer world, you learn really early on. If you think you know everything, you know nothing, because there are way too many things to know. So you're always tapping into colleagues. Hey, you ever set up this kind of network? Hey, you ever had this kind of problem? Hey, this, because you can't know everything. Here's a thing that many audiophiles think they know, but Diego Estan, our measurement specialist, and I talk about this often. Digital audio is really difficult. And okay, all these guys talk about digital filters, Dennis, and I go to the best digital designers, and I kind of draw them out, like we like to put an impulse response to see what kind of filter it is, if it's got pre-ringing or post-ringing or both, you know what I mean?
Right.
And say, what exactly is happening here?
Yeah.
And you know what? They have a tough time explaining it. and the audiophiles think they just know. Right? And you go to the best guys, and these guys are having, let me think about that for a sec. Right? Yeah. Here's exactly what's happening. It's if you think you know a lot, and this happens in audio, and this is where MQA really went off the rails. These guys are like, oh, wow, this makes perfect sense. And now this is all, they bought into it too easily because they thought they knew. And the real digital guy go, no, that's not the way it works.
Right.
You got to take a step back and say, I don't know if I really know the way it works. Years ago, I remember this, and I had to brush up. I'm pretty good with speaker measurements. And a really good designer came to me and said, hey, you're really, really good with speaker measurements, but you got to understand the phase and the crossover better. I can tell. And I said, you're right. I do, because I don't really know exactly what's happening in the phase shifts and at what frequency. So I studied it. And now I do have a really good idea on phase during the crossover region. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but the point is there's a lot to learn, a lot. And as I look at Diego's measurements, I'm like, oh, I'm learning now about amplifiers. This is really interesting.
Yeah. There's always something that somebody knows that you don't.
It's this idea of being open to learn. And I think that's a huge thing that for me, I need to be open to learn, and I have to remind myself to be open to learn and to kind of question what I think I know and go back and kind of make sure that I really know it or understand it. When you are not open to learning, you get stuck in these closed-minded beliefs that may not be relevant or true. So, yeah, with that, let's go into a musical break, and then after that, we'll continue this conversation on. welcome back to our discussion with Doug Schneider and Dennis Berger. On the break, Doug and I were just kind of thinking about something that we did last week, where we took a trip to Montreal, visited Sim Audio, but also visited an artist, a Canadian artist, Dominique Fils-Ami, who has an amazing voice and some really interesting conversation pieces as we spoke to her about hi-fi audio. So Doug, what did you think about that conversation?
Well, I'm going to throw it back to you, but the intention was because this happens in audio. Dennis, have you ever heard people proclaim, what's the artist's intent? We're relaying the artist's intent. Or this is right. Okay, right? Yeah. Right? And they're full of shit usually. You know, I do like dispelling. This is something I've learned in 25 years. There's a lot of audiophiles are full of shit, right? Oh, we're relaying the artist's intent. You don't even know what the artist's intent is. And in matter of fact, many times the artist doesn't have an intent either, and they're just going with the recording engineer. Yeah. But here was an artist with an intent. I talked to her manager, Kevin, at On Soul Records, and I said, we want her to talk about her upcoming album and her past album, but her upcoming album, Our Roots Run Deep. And what was your musical intent in what you wanted to convey in this album? So how many times, Dennis, have you heard the artist's intent, right?
I've heard it a lot. Yeah. And I'll tell you, for me, getting into audio production, even at the little level that I'm doing, has opened my eyes to how ridiculous that is. I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but back when Brent and I were doing the SoundStage podcast, our friend Terry Landry would give us demos. And they're MIDI, they're flat, they're not even samples. It's all synthesizer and everything. And he was like, man, if you want to remaster them for the podcast, go ahead. So I started applying some tape emulators, tape bus emulators, like reel-to-reel tape, right? And one of the parameters that those things will let you do is control the level of tape noise. So you can, in a way that you can't with actual tape, right? You can bring the tape noise up and down in the mix. And I found that I was increasing the tape noises on one of Terry's tracks, and all of a sudden, bam, the SoundStage gained this depth that just the instruments had three-dimensional placement from front to back where they didn't before. And all of a sudden they're extending out past the dimensions of the speakers. And it's like, wow, like, have I learned the secret to SoundStage here? Like, just add tape noise. And so I had that preset. I saved it. This is it. This is I named it Pop, right? This is my Pop preset because it's adding pop and depth to the SoundStage. I went and applied it to the next song. It did nothing, right? And so I basically just had to sort of fiddle around with the knobs again, and the balance of, hysteresis and noise, and all of a sudden I could get some image depth out of that. But it was all accidental, right? I mean, so much of this, and maybe somewhere out there, some genius like Bernie Grunman has figured out the exact relationship between, analog noise and SoundStage depth or whatever. But for the most part, I think it's just sort of like you get lucky, man. And at some point you listen to it and you go, yeah, it sounds good. I did good. Right?
I don't know of some true expert, because the more I get to know experts on a topic, they're more open-minded. The people with a little knowledge go, oh no, it's exactly this, it's exactly that. And they might go, I don't know. Might work, might not. But on Dominic, this was the eye-opening thing. So what did we learn her real in terms of the recording? What did we learn her real intent was, or what recording format conveyed her intent the most?
Yeah, so I think this was a really cool interview for me for a lot of different reasons. After speaking to a lot of the speaker designers, Bernie Grunman, Mark Waldrop, James Hale, like all these people, and kind of really hearing about how the artist has a vision, it was really interesting to then speak to an artist and hear what she had to say. And one of the things that was really eye-opening to me is she effectively chose the technology. She chose to use Dolby Atmos because her music is her own voice, and she layers her own voice in multiple tracks. And she wanted to take that and through Dolby Atmos have her own voice stacked on top of one another through different speakers in the environment to make it feel as if her song was giving the person a hug. and kind of completely surrounding the person with her layered track and her layered voice. So this is an example of her intent leading to the technology that's being used, as opposed to technology being kind of shoehorned into the art to kind of sell the technology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she was very passionate about this. She had a very like specific sound that she was going for, and she knew what she wanted. And you could see her when she was sitting there and she was listening to her track back. She's like, this is what I was looking for.
Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question, Jorden. Does learning things like that, as well as the stuff you've learned about speaker design and electronics and music mastering and room acoustics, put it all together, has that in any way changed your relationship with music? Has that changed the way you listen to music? Has it changed what you listen for?
Yes, 100%. Now, I'm not going to pretend like my ears are now tuned to some like holistic thing where I can.
What does that mean?
So, and this is an interesting point. When we talk about tune, like I'm not going to pretend that I'm listening to the to specific tones coming out of her voice, and I'm listening to like the noise or whether it has this feel, this analog versus digital versus the instruments and kind of whether it's in stereo or whether it's in Dolby Atmos or anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pretend that I'm listening to all of that. But what I think this highlights to me is when I do listen to something and I'm like, this song makes me feel really different or very good in like a specific way. It's what is it about this? Is it the song? Is it the way that it's being delivered? Or is it the delivery system, the speakers?
Yeah.
And I mean, we talked about this before. We talked about how like I think I mentioned that like I listen to Radar Love in pretty much any new car I get because it's just my driving song and I kind of know the way that song feels. And what I get out of different delivery systems, so speakers, can change even though the song itself remains the same or the copy that I'm listening to. When it comes to new music and kind of now when I listen to things, I might be able to distinguish and say, you know what? This song that I've listened to 100 times, to me, gives me a different feeling on one delivery system versus another. Or I might say, you know, I really liked, and I mean, Dominic feels at me, like she played and actually was very generous. She gave us her new album kind of pre-release. I think she has one of these songs released, but the rest are unreleased. And I'm listening to this and I'm like, I really like this song. And knowing, having talked to her, knowing kind of her thoughts and intentions behind the song, I'm like, this is feeling really good. And I think part of that is the kind of way in which she recorded it to transmit that feeling. And you kind of, you feel that, you actually sense that while you listen to the tracks.
So that's a really good answer to the question, does it change what you listen for?
Yep.
Follow up to that, has it changed what you listen to? Because I have to admit, I get a lot of criticism for the music that I listen to and that I audition gear with. And, you know, people tell me, no, George Michael, that is not proper audiophile music. No, Björk is not proper audiophile music. You need to listen to this instead. But I'm wondering, this is also fresh to you and you're getting a crash course. Has any of this changed perhaps what you will reach for when you're sitting down to listen to music?
So that's an interesting one. I also think I mentioned that I have like two small kids at home. So a lot of the time, the music that plays through the speakers in the living room and the kitchen and all that is not even music that I want to listen to. It's like kids songs and Paw Patrol and whatever it may be. But that's really interesting. One of the things that I try and ask everybody that comes on the show, and I think I've asked everyone that comes on, is kind of what's the soundtrack to their life, to kind of hear what people actually care about, what they listen to, what kind of engages them.
I will point out, though, when you asked Doug, he kind of dodged that question a little bit.
Did I? So we're going to get to it then. We're going to make sure that he answers it. And secretly what I'm doing, this is totally self-serving. Let me say that. I like write these down and then I like put them on my playlist and I listen to them and I'm like, oh, this is really good. Or like,
oh, far out. Yeah,
right. Like I try and really do that. So in terms of what I listen to, I could tell you that I'm trying to remember who it was that got me onto the Rite of Spring. It might have been Bernie Grundman that was like, no, you need to listen to the Rite of Spring.
That was probably either Bernie or Mark. Yeah.
Yeah. One of them.
It was Bernie. It was Bernie.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like I've listened to both of those. My wife's like, why are you listening to this? I'm like, I just need to listen to this. I need to get a sense of what's going on here. After I think it was again Bernie Grundman, like I downloaded more Carpenter stuff, which I haven't heard in forever. Steely Dan, like I now have a lot of stuff on here that I don't think I would have thought to listen to before talking to some of these people. But then at the same time, I still go back and I still like I appreciate Michael Johnson and how he was talking about how he listens to metal and stuff like that. So like that also sang to my heart because I still listen to metal. I still throw on my Slayer when I'm in the car alone and my wife's not there to tell me to turn down the anger.
Man, I was auditioning a pair of speakers yesterday that I'm reviewing for USA Today. I was rocking some Skrillex, right?
There you go.
That would just like mortify most of my colleagues in the industry. But it's like, I know what it ought to sound like, and I know how it stresses a speaker. So it's perfectly fine test material. And you know what? I kind of like it. So
yeah, I think what you're doing is a good idea, Jorden. You can't listen to everything. But what I find is, I don't know if it was Dennis who did you post that article that the lady wrote about listening to the two guys talk about the best albums on the train and totally dismissing her? Did you post that one?
I didn't post that, but I remember the article. It was really good. Yeah,
it was really funny because these two young guys who think they know everything about music are pontificating on the train so that everybody can hear, and she's now a little old lady who does know a lot about music and calls them a couple asshats for their knowledge of things, right? Or what they think they know. And while you can't learn everything, you hear something. I remember Bascom King saying, you can't make a judgment on an amplifier until you've experienced this amplifier, to kind of as a benchmark reference. You hear these people come out with this certain gear. Oh, this is the best thing. Well, have you heard this? And same with music. Have you actually heard it? Have you actually listened to this? That sort of thing. You might want to expand your horizons as much as you can. So I think that's a good idea that you're giving this stuff a try. I try to do it I tell Jason Thorpe all the time, when it comes to certain hardware topics, we can't just shit on the idea if we haven't experienced it, because somebody can always use that against you. But once you say, well, no, I did experiment with it and didn't do anything.
A quick aside: are you going to experiment with network jumper cables to change the frequency roll-off of your?
The network switch has given me a tough time, and Jason too. But we've already done some of our own experiments with Diego, and they might be eye-opening. But you'll of course
Diego
get somebody.
Actually did. Diego brought receipts. Man, he had measurements.
Yeah, exactly. But then you'll still get the people, well, I think I heard a difference. Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But anyway, you got to do your due diligence. You can't just, you don't know how many times because I'm seriously into movies. People say, I'll never see that because, I heard it's like this. Did you see it?
You got to watch
it's not really, you didn't really see it because it's not really just because somebody said, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You at least speak from a point of knowledge, not ignorance.
So there's a line, and I don't know if it was René Descartes. I'm trying to remember exactly who said it, but it was like, I'd rather have my mind open by wonder than closed by belief.
Yeah.
And it's like, I have to remind myself of that all the time when I start getting opinionated on something. When you start talking to me about like, oh, this camera is better. And I'm like, no, like I like my thing. I gotta open my mind to the wonder of possibilities, then kind of just believe that I'm right and close that option off.
Well, just like the Rite of Spring thing, I'm back to the movies. For years, I avoided watching Citizen Kane because I thought I saw some preview and I thought, oh, I don't want to sit through all that. And then one day I said, I got to watch it. And I'll tell you, I was jumping for the remote control to pause things within the first 2 minutes. I was like, how did he do that? When the camera comes up over the bill, I'm like, whoa, this is really unbelievable. How did they pull the camera back through here? And then there's videos on the tricks of Citizen Kane. And I'm like, okay, I get it now. I get why people have to have seen Citizen Kane, because when you look at what was accomplished back then,
oh, it's insane.
You're like, okay, this is landmark stuff right here. Okay, I get it. So you can't come at things from a place of ignorance,
Are you waking up and screaming Rosebud?
Yeah, not right
now. No? Okay.
just like if you want to talk about epic movies, and I will always say to people, have you seen Goodfellas? Have you seen?
So good.
It's so good.
So good.
You better have seen Martin Scorsese's movies before you tell me that, some guy who makes a Transformers movie is the best director.
That's fair.
I got a question for both of you to get us back on track.
Yep.
This sort of school session for Jorden has run now for 6 months. This is our 6-month anniversary of season 2 of the podcast. We've covered some pretty cool topics, and Jorden, I know for you, there's always the question of you don't know what you don't know, but just sort of to the best of your ability. And Doug, I want you to answer this as well. What do you want to learn about next? What topics do you want to sort of tackle in the next 6 months? What is it that you maybe don't know or understand yet, but you're intrigued to learn more about? And for you, Doug, what do you want, and what do you think who do you think we need to talk to? Who do you think we need to bring in? What do you think Jorden needs to learn?
So I think for me, there's a lot, and you kind of said it. I don't know what I don't know. So one thing that I was kind of thinking about, and I mentioned it to both of you, which is I would love to kind of hear from the people that listen to this podcast, and I want to hear from them and see if there's something that they believe that I got wrong, I got right, I didn't explore enough, I should explore more, or that they'd be curious to kind of have us find somebody that can be an expert that says, this is the topic. So I think that to me would be really interesting. It'd be really kind of cool to hear what people that are listening to this, because we see the listenership. There is quite a bit of people that listen to this. So I'm sure there's some opinions there. I'm sure there's some knowledge there that we could tap into that would give us more insight onto different topics. I know for me, especially after kind of doing this interview with Dominique last week, the artist intent piece, which I thought was just kind of like a cheesy tagline, I think there's a lot more weight to it than I originally believed. So I'd love to hear from some different artists about their intent behind different pieces, and if that actually transferred through to the final product. So I think that would be interesting. I'd also there's a lot when it comes to speaker designs that I'm still curious about. How do you get speakers that are so big and so massive? How do you even think of like designing those? Where do you think those are going to be played versus kind of more modest stuff? So there's kind of a piece there that I'm also curious about, like how big is too big? How small is too small? And how do people or how do companies decide what makes sense for their particular products? So I think that would be another interesting bit. Doug?
Yeah, and I want him to talk to people. I think there's a lot of knowledge to be gained. You can't talk to everybody, but we were on the phone last week, Jorden and I, with the people at Paradigm Anthem, and we were talking about bringing on, and the topic of a guy named Dr. Peter Shook came up, and I'm like, oh yeah, you know what? And we're going to be doing a thing, because Shook himself, now he's one of the people behind Anthem, and his background came from NRC. He's PhD in math. And I think the topic on the podcast will be the history of Anthem and room correction, because Shook is one of the pioneers of room correction system. This is where ARC comes from, Anthem Room Correction System. But he was working on this way back, I don't know if in the 80s, but the 90s for sure. And I remember in the 80s, he did his a thesis and he created crossover modeling software that Paul Barton, I think, still uses today. Back when computers were not used for design, he was doing the software, and then he got into room correction systems, which has evolved into the Anthem room correction system. And to do a history of guys like him and other people to bring in the knowledge that they have so that people can understand, hey, some of this stuff goes way, way back. You know, I was shocked when I was talking to Peter Thomas at PMC, and I had to look it up, and he was 100% correct. He used to work at the BBC. You know, they were using digital broadcasting back in 1972. They had 12-bit digital to analog converters. They had the radio broadcast. A lot of this history to bring that into the podcast. There are still a lot of people out there. Lawrence Dickey, of course, his history at B&W and whatnot, and probably other people you might know too, Dennis, who he should talk to. I'd like to see that happen. We got Shook. We've got Lawrence Dickey and others like that who could educate about what happened in the past.
Very cool.
So with that, Doug or Dennis, both of you, is there anything else that you kind of want to talk about before we close off this episode?
You know, there is something I wanted to bring up earlier, and then we got onto something else about the whole digital and analog thing and this polarizing nature of audio. I watched this really good interview on YouTube, and we can put this in the show notes, with Rick Rubin and Neil Young. And it was about a new album Neil Young recently had. I don't think anybody knew about it. I don't think it sold very well. But, you know, Neil Young's this guy who's always been, digital's all wrong. And he was doing a bit of that in this interview. But in this interview, what came out was, when Rubin records, and you could see that Rick Rubin is not just digital or analog, there's room for both. But what was really interesting was, and Neil Young had to concede that this was the best way to do it, was when they record analog, they immediately transfer it to digital. Immediately. Like, he has his equipment modified, so the analog is never played back, because what Rubin said is it never plays consistently the second time.
Right.
The tape changes, the playback mechanism, all this type of thing. So when they're recording analog, they're making it digital and right away, and then working with that. And Neil Young had to, kind of confess that, yeah, it's the best way to do it because analog degrades. And this whole polarizing nature, maybe you explore that more too. Why people get polarized, because the truth is always in the middle.
That's really cool. All right. Now, with that under wraps, Dennis, was there anything from your end that you were thinking about?
I'm just taking notes in the background for show ideas, man. It's like, I'm ready to, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. Good. We've got episodes in the pipeline. Yes.
Perfect. All
the
right.
producer's nightmare here.
Exactly. So with that, I think we're going to transition to the famous last question. And apparently, Doug, you got called out. You didn't answer last time. So what's the soundtrack to your life? What music are you listening to, even now, or kind of generally speaking?
Okay, I'm just going with what popped to mind, because Jason Thorpe, our SoundStage Ultra senior editor, and I have been talking about this album, Tragically Hip Live at the Roxy. It's a fairly recent release, but it was recorded in 1991 when the band had brought out Road Apples, which is one of their best albums. Now, what Live at the Roxy really captures is you can see how they really could play live, but the damn album sounds live. Like, it sounds like a band in a club. It's unbelievably good, and it shows you what the Tragically Hip were about. And the Tragically Hip are still around, but Gord Downey died several years ago of brain cancer, and so he'll never be back. But it's just a fabulous album. So Jason and I have been talking about that, so that's what pops to mind.
Dennis, any changes from the last time? Is there a different soundtrack to your life this time around?
Oh man, I was really hoping you wouldn't ask me this question. So I am a grown ass man, and yet my favorite television show of all time is Adventure Time.
Oh, nice. Love it.
And recently, for whatever reason, the soundtrack to the Stakes miniseries, which was about Marceline the Vampire Queen, has just been on constant repeat in my headphones. Olivia Olson, who was do you guys remember the movie Love Actually?
Yep.
Yeah.
Do you know the little girl that sings "All I Want for Christmas Is You"?
I remember the scene.
Yeah, so that little girl, she grew up to be the voice of Marceline the Vampire Queen, and she is just an incredible singer. And so for whatever reason, we have not had, my wife and I every few years just completely rewatch Adventure Time from beginning to end, all 10 seasons. And life has been hectic lately. We haven't had time to do that recently. So I've just had the soundtrack for Stakes on nearly constant repeat. So that is my completely and utterly humiliating soundtrack to my life right now. But it is, for whatever reason, it's what I need emotionally.
And how about you, Jordan? Besides Radar Love,
there is a band called July Talk. I think they might have actually been from Ottawa originally, but I listened to them a while ago. And for some reason, they've just been stuck in my head the last couple of weeks. So I've been listening to The Garden by July Talk. This guy has like this really nice, raspy voice, and it's really interesting stuff. Other than that, some Elliott Smith.
Ooh.
Between the Bars. I recently rewatched Good Will Hunting. So that was coming up there. What other stuff? The Dominic Feels on Me, I started listening to her album just because it's a pre-release, so I thought it would be really cool. And I've been listening to that.
And obviously, the name of that album, we'll have videos about it on our YouTube channel.
Yep.
Our Roots Run Deep. We should have those out. Deep. It's being released, I think, the third week of September, and we'll have videos out before then.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. I also randomly was listening to some like Chuck Berry recently. Yeah, nice. No particular place to go. For some reason, that just kind of came in and was like, this is appropriate based on where I am and what I'm doing in my life at the moment. Taking a kind of break from some different stuff. So yeah, that's my on the spot what I've been listening to. And with that, just before we sign off, Doug, was there any particular links or any particular videos that you wanted to highlight or share or call out?
No, we'll put what I mentioned about Neil Young and Dominic Feels Me. We'll put that all in the show notes. So look down there on the SoundStage.life website, or you'll see it on YouTube down below in the description section.
Or also that publishes to Spotify and iTunes and all of the other podcatchers too. You just got to look below the headline. So.
The key is look below the headline, just like Dennis said. We'll put that all there. We mentioned lots of stuff. Maybe we'll put in a link for Goodfellas too, you know?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, definitely got to watch Goodfellas. Dennis, anything you want to call out?
I don't know if your listeners actually know this, but months and months after Brent and I had to step away from the SoundStage podcast, we launched a new podcast, Audio Unleashed. We're still baby fresh. We do not have the audience that the SoundStage podcast does, but I don't know, some of your listeners might dig what we're doing. So just find us at Audio Unleashed. We're on all the normal podcatchers, and also most importantly, check out my stuff at SoundStage Access. I got some cool stuff coming out, and I think particularly your people who are resonating with your journey are going to like the stuff I'm writing about on SoundStage Access.
And write up what the F is inner detail.
Yes, sir. I'm on it, boss.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming by and chatting. All the best, everyone.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.